Today I'm very pleased to be able to present my work on an analysis of the variety of English taught in German secondary schools, and I've entitled this presentation and this paper Schulenglisch, which is a lovely compound noun in German that has school and English, so school English literally, and it's a very frequent compound noun that you'll even find in the Duden, and it is defined as the English knowledge that is acquired at school. And it's actually a term that I found in a large corpus of web German as well, in lots of interesting contexts. And I wanted to bring this one to the fore: school English and the original. Two worlds collide. And so there is this perception very often in German-speaking countries that this school English, Schulenglisch, is somehow different to naturally occurring English, to original English, to authentic or real-life English, in some way that's not been really defined so far. And so I'm very interested in the language of textbooks in general, and in this particular study I'm focusing on German school English as a foreign language textbooks. Why? Well, simply because textbooks in Germany and really across Europe at least are very central to English language teaching. We know that input is very important for second language learning and teaching, and the textbook forms the main source of input in the second language classroom. Now, of course, textbooks now come in all kinds of forms, so it's really a textbook package which includes audio material, video materials, apps, and so on and so forth. So my research questions are, first of all, to what extent Schulenglisch varies across different registers, across different textbook proficiency levels, and across textbook series. And then, of course, I'm interested in the extent to which Schulenglisch differs, and if so, how Schulenglisch differs from the kind of naturally occurring English that learners can be expected to encounter and use outside the EFL classroom. So you can imagine that I need some data to do that. On the one hand, some Schulenglisch, some textbook data, and on the other hand, some kind of data to represent naturally occurring extracurricular English. So let's begin with the textbook English corpus. This is a large corpus of textbooks that I actually compiled as part of my PhD. And the full corpus has 42 textbook volumes and 9 textbook series in 3 different countries, or from 3 different countries. In this study, I'm focusing on the German subcorpus, and that's 3 textbook series, 9 textbook volumes. What is special about this corpus is that I've identified text units within each textbook volume, and I've manually annotated those for textbook register, and those are the registers that I identified and annotated. Now, in terms of comparison, I'm looking at 3 different reference corpora. On the one hand, a youth fiction corpus, which I compiled myself with extracts from 300 novels targeted at teenagers and young adults. On the other hand, a conversation reference corpus, that's the Spoken BNC 2014 that many of you will be familiar with. And finally, an informative website for teens corpus, which I compiled using from websites for English speakers, but specifically targeted at teenagers. So this enables me to have these 3 register-based comparisons as well. Now, very briefly about the methods, I was very interested in trying to get a broad understanding of what represents Schulenglisch, and to this end I ended up looking at the MDA framework, that's multidimensional analysis, a method developed by Dr. Spiber, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the book from 1988. Very, very briefly, the method involves, first of all, compiling a large corpus that represents the full varieties that you want to study, and in this case, in Biber's case, it was full varieties of register varieties of written and spoken English. And then for each of these texts in this large corpus, it's necessary to identify, tag, and count then a broad range of linguistic features. So we end up with a very large table for every single text. We have frequency counts for all kinds of different linguistic features, and we can from that compute a correlation matrix of frequencies across all the text in the corpus. And so this is what an annotated text might look like. You can see that for every single word I have one or more tag. And then these tags are counted, and we compute standardized, normalized frequencies and end up with a correlation matrix that looks something like this. Now, this is high dimensional data, and this is not the sort of thing that a human can interpret. And so this is where a statistical method is used to reduce that dimensionality to just a few dimensions that explain, hopefully, a large amount of the shared variance in that correlation matrix. And that's not where it ends, because, of course, once you have extracted these main dimensions of variation within the corpus, then it's necessary to interpret them. So in my work, I've been using a sort of revised MDA framework, made quite a few changes, which I don't have time to go into right now. For a lot of these changes, I've ended up implementing them in a tagger, the multi-feature tagger of English, which you can find on GitHub. In this study, I used the Perl version, but there is now a Python version, which I've developed together with Mohammed Shakir, for which I can send a link as well, which I recommend using rather than this older Perl version. And essentially, all of these aspects that sort of constitute the revised MDA framework aim at increasing both the replicability and the reproducibility of the analysis. And so you can find all the details in the online appendix to my PhD, which is online and contains all of the code and so on and so forth. But I would like to present a few results. So as a reminder, we're looking at 3 textbook series used in Germany. That's 15 textbooks in total, and 3 reference corpora, so a total of over 4,000 texts, and 73 mostly lexical grammatical features and a few semantic features too. I ended up choosing a model with 3 dimensions. And so this is what this model looks like on a 3-dimensional plot. Every single point represents a text on this plot, and it's probably a little bit difficult to discern at this stage, but what we have here are really 3 clusters that are quite clearly defined, a dark blue one, a red and a green, and then clustered towards the middle, we have the textbook text, with one exception, and that's the orange that you can see here. Those are instructional texts from the textbooks, and they are very different on one dimension, namely on the 3rd dimension. But it is rather difficult to see this on a 3-dimensional plot, so let's move to 2 dimensions. This is the same thing on the 1st and 2nd dimension only, and again, every single point represents a text. Now I've also added some ellipses that represent 90% confidence intervals around the mean of each sub-corpus. And what we can see again are the 3 ellipses from the reference corpora, here the large one in dark blue from the informative teens corpus, in dark green the reference corpus for fiction, and in dark red for conversation. And we can see that these do not overlap on this combination of the 1st and 2nd dimension. However, we see that the textbooks corpora do overlap quite a bit in the middle of the plot here. This 1st dimension on the x-axis accounts for a large chunk of the variance. It's very similar to Biber's 1st dimension. It represents a continuum between highly interactional, spontaneous spoken English on the one hand, and then informative, dense written language on the other. And what we can see is that we have on this dimension quite a lot of overlap for the informative register between the textbook language in purple and the reference informative texts. But we still see a shift of the textbook ellipses towards the middle of the plot, so towards the more spoken end of the dimension. And by contrast, if we turn to the conversation register, here we see very little overlap between the reference conversational data and the textbook dialogues. And this includes, the textbook data includes the transcripts of the audio and video materials from the textbooks. Very little overlap here, and this yellow ellipsis is very much shifted towards the more informative written end of the dimension as compared to the Spoken BNC 2014. The 2nd dimension that we see here is also very similar to Biber's 2nd dimension. It's a contrast between the fictional register. So here we see a lot of overlap actually between the textbook data, which is the light green ellipsis, and the reference fictional data. But again, the textbook ellipsis is very much shifted towards the center of the plot. So a lot of overlap between these different textbook registers, some register-based variation, but a lot less than in the reference data. We can look at the features that contribute to the positions of these texts on these two dimensions. This is a plot of features, again, on the first and second dimension, and you can imagine it as being superimposed on the scatter plot of text, something like this, so that the features that are towards this end are the ones that are very frequent in the text that we find in this area of the graph. And so, for instance, we see that informative texts have a high density of nouns, of prepositions, longer words on average, high lexical density. And the highly conversational text, spontaneous, interactional language have a lot of verbal contractions, discourse markers, yes, no questions, negation, demonstrative pronouns, and so on and so forth. I've also looked at these dimension scores across different factors that might drive variation. And so on this first dimension, what we see is that register plays a very important role. Register is the main driver of variation on this first dimension. By contrast, the textbook series, we see no significant difference and very, very small estimates here. The textbook proficiency level does play a role for informative text. Here we find that informative texts in beginner textbooks, I mean, they're very rare, and when they do occur, we do see that they are more like spoken language in the textbooks, and they become more similar to the reference data as textbook proficiency increases, so as we expect students to be more proficient in English. On the conversational end, we have two things going on here. On the one hand, we have some features that are very typical of spoken English that are rarer in textbook dialogues. So we have fewer contractions, we have less negation, fewer demonstrative pronouns, some of the features that are here, but the main effect is actually that we have more features that are typical of informative written language in the textbook dialogues than we would expect. And so it's really also higher frequencies of these features that lead to the textbook dialogue text being shifted towards the middle of the plot. And here we see no effect of textbook proficiency levels. So it's not as if the texts are becoming more natural-like as textbook proficiency is increasing. That is not what we can observe here. And it's very interesting to look at the text themselves to see what these features are and in what context they occur. I'd just like to briefly mention the third dimension. This is the dimension that I've plotted here on the y-axis. So here, this is the first dimension again, and on the y-axis I now have the third dimension, which explains about 7% of the variance in the data. And I've interpreted this dimension as a didacticized versus natural English dimension. And that's because we really see that the reference data here scores around the same sort of scores on this dimension. And the textbook data is scores much lower. And so we have these shifts in and these ellipses. The textbook dialogue data is very much shifted towards the negative end of this dimension. And most negative scores are the instructional texts that are very clearly defined as a specific register with very specific linguistic characteristics on this dimension. What are those characteristics? You won't be very surprised when you see them. They are the ones that we would expect to find in this kind of instructional language. Imperative verbs are very frequent. We find a lot of occurrences of second-person references, of yes and no questions, WH questions, and the likes. So for instructional language, not so surprising, it's interesting to see that the other textbook registers are also scoring lower on this dimension. And that's because very typical Schulenglisch language includes a lot of imperative verbs, for instance, but also includes a lot of references to second-person pronouns and a lot of questions as well. On this third dimension, we see a very clear effect for proficiency level, not so much for register. There is very little, in fact, or hardly any variation driven by register here, but very much by textbook proficiency level. And you can see that the greatest differences are with the beginner textbooks for all 3 registers that I've got here. And as learners are expected to become more proficient in English, then we find that the text on this dimension resemble much more the reference data. So that's an encouraging finding, I would say. Here's an example of an informative text that scores relatively low on this 3rd dimension. It's from a textbook used in 2nd year of English tuition at secondary school. And one of the main features of this 3rd dimension is also the use of can as a modal. And by opposition, higher texts that score higher on this 3rd dimension use pretty much all other modals apart from can. And can really seems to be the modal of choice in Schulenglisch. So we can see lots of those. We also see lots of occurrences of you. We also find lots of questions. And those are some of the features that are very typical of Schulenglisch on this 3rd dimension. So very briefly, what can we conclude in terms of Schulenglisch? That it does vary across text register, in particular on this 1st dimension, which explains the most variation. So it is an important source of variation. Some variation can also be attributed to textbook proficiency level, and in my study, hardly any, pretty much no differences could be seen across the textbook series. How does Schulenglisch differ? In lots of different ways. The main finding is probably that register variation is much more constrained in textbooks as compared to sort of extracurricular English. And there are some features that are typical of Schulenglisch, which include can as a modal, which include questions, both yes/no questions and WH questions, the high frequency of imperative, not only in instructional language, but also in the other text registers in the textbook. Those are some of the features that are very typical of Schulenglisch. And of course, Schulenglisch is characterized by an absence or the much rarer use of some complex, especially syntactic features, which we only find in the more advanced textbooks. Methodological implications I haven't really had a chance to talk about, but we certainly see that we need to account for register and proficiency level based variation when we look at the language of textbooks and when we look at Schulenglisch. And I think there are also implications in terms of materials design that probably need to be more corpus based and need to take register variation more into account. I'm very interested in the use of corpora for materials design. I invite you to have a look at this open educational resource, this ebook that I co-created with my students, in which we do just that. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.